In the wake of Link's Awakening, it's no surprise Nintendo wanted more handheld Zelda. For whatever reason, Nintendo neglected to do this themselves, instead passing off the work to Capcom's Flagship division, which worked closely with Nintendo for a couple years. The nearly unknown director, Hidemaro Fujibayashi, would helm the collaboration, and his work impressed so much that following Flagship's Shuttering, he would go on to direct a few games you may have heard of, like Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild. This perhaps overly ambitious project came in the form of 3 proposed Zelda games: The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages and The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons, which were designed as a pair, and their planned sequel, The Mystical Seeds of Courage, a semi-remake of Zelda 1 and follow-up to the duology that never released due to issues with the linked game system that I'll touch on later. Ages and Seasons are so closely linked that doing the games separately is basically impossible, so this is going to be a long one, as I'm sure the runtime shows. Before getting to each game, general stuff is the same between both. They share an engine, they share the same gameplay with a few unique twists, and they look and sound similarly, obviously with their own little flares in the visual and audio departments. Gameplay is the fairly standard top-down Zelda fare, but with the same somewhat compromised controls that Link's Awakening worked with. Like most of the series, the player controls Link, exploring, fighting with various items, and solving puzzles in the dungeons or overworld. Whereas Zelda games on consoles with a reasonable amount of buttons give action, shield, and sword their own buttons, the Game Boy has to make do with 2 buttons, 1 item on each, which means Link doesn't always necessarily have to be wielding his sword. Being top-down, there's much less complexity to the movement from here. Link's only non-item related action is movement. The simplicity of the system isn't really limiting though, it just means the focus is on combining 2 items at once and exploration, although that's a game-by-game thing honestly. It's a strong gameplay system and has plenty of flexibility to design great stuff around. One unique element in both games is the ring system, a light RPG element that the series rarely travels into despite its setting. Through treasure chests, gacha seeds, a small system where seeds can be planted for rewards later, or a few other events, Link can collect rings which can be equipped one at a time for bonuses, extra attack or defense, immunity to certain types of damage, or just cosmetic stuff. It's a bit of an understated system since Link can't use multiple rings at the same time, but given the game's director, it seems safe to say that the general idea would influence his later works with the franchise, like Skyward Sword introducing the level up system for certain items and Breath of the Wild having way more RPG elements in the weapon system. Both games look great as well. The Game Boy Color gives surprisingly varied color to create a huge variety of unique locations, and there's some ridiculously good artwork in the still image cutscenes. The art style of the game is fantastic. I love how soft and round everything looks in the official art. It's simplistic, but in a cute, semi-chibi kind of way, not a blocky and decipherable way. Both games also feel different from any other Zelda game and each other, ditching Hyrule for unique new spots, each with their own unique themes and landmarks. My only complaint with the visuals is that all the dungeons look kinda like... well, they look like dungeons, and I'm sure the intention with that was to prioritize clarity in puzzles, which is good, but a little more theming in the dungeons wouldn't hurt. A lot of them kind of blend together visually. There's lots of gray walls. Music in both games is great. If it hasn't been apparent from my other videos, I'm not very good at music. If it sounds good, I like it, but I can't really go into depth about musical critique. It's just not my thing, but that said, every track in both games is very hummable and expressive, whether it's setting up joyful exploration, end capping a dungeon, or setting up the anticipation of ending things. Both games are extremely well put together. This is kinda all I can say before getting into each game. They're both very different from one another, so I'm gonna go ahead and start with The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages, as the game is often listed first. The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages is the puzzle half of the pair. While both games still have action and puzzles, they each focus slightly more on one aspect over the other. Like many Zelda games, Ages is named after a major plot element. In this case, Nayru, the Oracle of Ages, an avatar of the goddess of the same name with providence over time, a power that Link inherits to swap between the past and present, the primary hook or gimmick of the game. The opening cutscene begins with Link in Hyrule. After getting into the castle, he reaches the Triforce and is warped away. Called to in a dream, Link awakens in Labrina, a country near to and related to Hyrule, somehow still under the power in some way of Princess Zelda, but completely autonomous as well. When he awakens, he meets Impa, Zelda's nurse. Pushing aside a large stone, Link and Impa find Nayru singing for the animals of the forest. Now past the barricade that protected Labrana, the Witch Veron drops her control of Impa and takes control of Nayru, and flees to the past to begin enacting destruction from there. Nairu's friend and guardian, Ralph, leaves to the past to help her, and Link is given a wooden sword. This pretty much does what one would expect: slash enemies and cut grass, as well as having a spin attack that deals double damage when it collides with an enemy and also cuts grass and other objects in a circle around Link. With this sword in hand, Link can enter Lina City, the central hub of the map. Plenty goes on here: side quest, the shop, where Link will almost certainly be too poor to buy anything at this stage, and the ring shop, where Link can get the ring box to carry and equip his first ring. Although at this point he'll only have the first trophy ring, rings with no effects given to mark achievements like lifetime kills. A small mini-dungeon, Maku Road, leads to the Maku Tree, although the dungeon lacks anything save for a few empty rooms this first pass. The Maku Tree, a female tree with an incredibly detailed anime face that looks a little bit weird. It's uncomfortable. The Maku Tree begins to tell Link to stop Veron before disappearing due to something happening in the past, and with no other choice, Link follows Ralph into the past. While in the past, things tend to be similar but different. The map's layout is roughly the same, but small details change through time. Trees and terrain grow and morph. Lina City is only a village, loomed by Queen Ambi's under-construction Black Tower, which the people of the city are forced to build during the endless day that Veron has caused. Originally built to search for a long-lost love, but stolen by Veron to build a tower for an unknown, darker purpose. In the tower, Link can find the shovel, a tool that lets him dig up ground anywhere he goes, and move piles of dirt that block his path. Digging is an incredibly good way to generate rupee, a fact that's not relevant yet, but will be down the road. Ages can be pretty stingy with item drops. It's a little surprising given how often enemies in pretty much every other game in the series just drop money and hearts all the time, but you can go quite a while on low health in this one. Returning to Maku Road, the past version, it's still short but actually lays out the game's basic mechanics. Basic enemy encounters with some of the game's most common enemies, pushing blocks to activate doors or that are placed as obstacles, and finding keys to progress. It's not the franchise's most subtle tutorial, but it's a perfectly acceptable intro into the dungeons. After defeating the moblins attacking her, the Maku Tree asks Link to meet her in 400 years and promises to be his bride, which is honestly kinda cute. Returning to the present through another portal, the Maku Tree points Link towards the old graveyard and gives him the Seed Satchel, a versatile item that holds various seeds that cover the functions of various items from previous games, starting with Ember Seeds, which act like the lantern from earlier games, burning small trees and lighting torches. While seeds are limited, most major locations have a seed tree, a little more on those later. Now that Link likely has money, he can also get the wooden shield. It blocks attacks. It's useful, but it's not used a whole lot in any major way. A lot of the times it's better to just be on the offensive. Under a bush in the graveyard, Link finds the graveyard key, and with it can enter the game's first dungeon, Spirit's Grave, in about 20 minutes, so the intro is not that long. The intro is great. It moves quickly, sets up a relatively interesting story with clear stakes. The people in the past are enslaved, and the people in the present are getting equally fucked up and turned to stone. It introduces a handful of simple items that have lots of use throughout the game, and gets the player up to speed with what the game is going to be like. Spirit's Grave itself, on the other hand, feels a bit redundant and simple for its own good. Not to say it's bad, just that it feels a little excessive. It and the second dungeon probably could have been combined just to keep the pace of the game up a little bit more. There's more block pushing, which is in basically every dungeon in this game, and the other. The dice blocks are introduced, a fun little puzzle with 3 colors placed opposite their matching sides on a cube that Link can roll to activate switches by getting the correct side facing up, and which doesn't come up nearly enough, although I suppose it only has so much potential in its very small concept. In a move that's surprisingly not followed up much in later dungeons, the mid-boss and boss of Spirit's Graves do actually match with the dungeon's theming. The mid-boss, Giant Guinea, is a huge ghost that spawns baby ghosts that slow Link down when they grapple him. Given his lack of items, Guinea is a simple mash fest of just slashing away with the sword. Like I said, this dungeon feels largely redundant, like it could have just been skipped to move along a little faster. For defeating Giant Guinea, Link gets the Power Bracelet, which lets him push and lift jars, certain enemies, and rocks. What is useful throughout the entire game, it's not really an exciting first item, more a way to just move certain obstacles. A few rooms of broken jars later, Link runs into the boss, Pumpkinhead, who isn't much more complex than Giant Guinea. Slash at him until his body disappears, lift the head up with the bracelet, and toss it on top of the spirit and move on. Spirit's Grave isn't bad, the stuff it introduces is good and it's functional, but given the strength of the earlier tutorial, it feels a bit underwhelming. Link gets the first of the 8 Essences of Time, the Eternal Spirit, and the Maku Tree contacts him to inform him that the next dungeon is in the Western Woods. This is something I do like about the game, actually. While the path ahead is always clear-cut, there's no ambiguity of where to go. The path there is often a journey, to the point that the journey between dungeons is usually better than the actual dungeons themselves. Before the next dungeon, there are a few small things that are recurrent and important that mostly start here. Outside of the dungeon, behind a rock, a ghost can be found who gives Link the first item in the trading sequence. While I won't go too deep into it, it's one of Zelda's most complex as it requires moving back and forth between time, culminating in Link receiving the upgraded sword, the Noble Sword, which deals double damage and shoots beams when swung at full health. Second is Maple, a witch's apprentice who appears in select locations every time Link defeats 30 enemies, 15 if he's equipped with the Maple Ring. Bumping into her gives him a chance to pick up scattered goodies, mostly seeds and rupees, but also including items as good as rings, a magic potion that heals him when his health is depleted, acting as the fairies from the earlier games, and a heart piece. Finally are Gacha Seeds, which can be planted in set spots, each of which has an invisible value determining the quality of the reward it drops after it grows. Rings, rupees, and all the way up to a heart piece once again. Tying 2 entire heart pieces to RNG like this is pretty tedious, and it'll take a bit of grinding to get either of these at the end of the game, never mind more or less needing a guide to find the gacha soil that allows the heart piece to spawn. I certainly would have preferred if a major collectible like this wasn't tied to something like this, because believe me, it takes a while to get these. It is not generous RNG. To the west is Fairies Woods, where Link will need to track down 3 fairies who have jumbled the map layout. I don't know if there's a discernible pattern to this part. Going places seems pretty random, although I did seem to end up in the same spots by repeating actions. But eventually, after enough trial and error, the player will stumble into all 3. After the fairies return the woods to proper order, Link can go to the dungeon, but moving the rock blocking it causes it to collapse. With it inaccessible in the present, Link will need to find his way back to the past. At Nairu's house, Link gets the Harp of Ages as well as its first song, the Tune of Echoes. This song is fairly limited. Link can only use it to activate portals to the overworld, and as such, can't make many freeform decisions with it yet. It's a build-up to the more complex songs he gets later, although I don't know that the gimmick is so complex that it needs to be so restricted outside of just being there to prevent sequence breaking. Also, even if there's no portal on screen, accidentally pressing the Harp of Ages while it's equipped plays the entire song every time, and then just gives Link a message that he can't warp. So remember to unequip it when you're not using it, just in case. The past version of Fairies Woods is the Deku Forest. With the dungeon blocked off, Link will need to poke around the forest filled with caves and enemies to find what NPCs in the area refer to as the thing Queen Ambi is looking for. At the end of the forest maze, Link finds mystery seeds. Their primary use for now is feeding them to owl statues for hints, but they have some weird properties that aren't relevant for a good while. Ambi's guards will escort Link to the palace once he gets the seeds, where he trades the seeds for bombs. Pull one out, throw it to destroy obstacles, or use it as a slightly not so great weapon. It deals okay damage, it's just actually hitting things with it. Now capable of destroying the barrier in front of the second dungeon, Link can enter the Wing Dungeon. Again, the Wing Dungeon is a bit simple and redundant. It may have been best to take Spirit's Grave and Wing Dungeon and make them into one dungeon called the Wing Dungeon. Spiked enemies appear here with a cool gimmick. They can be flipped by bumping into them with a shield to open them up for attacks. More complex dice puzzles that would have fit better with the others from the previous dungeon. Still a good puzzle type though. Bombs can open a few hidden paths, minecarts are introduced which pull Link between rooms and can be redirected by activating switches on the track. This dungeon also expands the 2D areas, like Link's Awakening. They're small 2D side-scrolling areas. Link behaves the same as he does from the top-down perspective, but always falls down towards the bottom of the screen. They tend to have some platforming challenges as opposed to puzzles, and are a fun little break to the normal action. The mid-boss Swoop attacks by flying about and dropping himself on Link, at which point Link can retaliate. Swoop's attacks destroy the center part of the floor to make things harder, but Link can just hang out on the edges which don't break to make things a bit easier on himself. The bosses do get better, but because of the limited item availability, the first few dungeons have a lot of the / type bosses. After the mid-boss, Link gets the Rock's Feather, basically a jump button. This allows him to skip over large gaps, dodge ground-based attacks, and of course actually platform in the 2D sections. A new type of switch, whose colors cycles when jumped over, is also introduced, allowing for some puzzles based around matching patterns elsewhere in the room, which are an interesting idea, but one with very minimal complexity and growth. It's used a couple times and then abandoned because they ran out of ideas, in other words. Although they do get a cool use in the finale of the dungeon where the color of the switch changes which blocks Link can push for a fun little matching puzzle. Head Thwomp is the boss of the dungeon and a bit of an odd one. He's a 2D boss. Head Thwomp hangs in the air cycling between 4 faces. Link needs to throw bombs into it while it's red to deal damage. Landing in any of the others causes a retaliatory attack specific to each face. After each hit, the cycling of the faces becomes faster and faster. It's a pretty good boss for what it is, given Link's limited tools. Certainly a lot better than the last one. But from here on out, the game gets a lot more complex and interesting. With the Head Thwomp gone, Link gets the Ancient Wood and the Maku Tree hints that the next step is to find a way to sail to Crescent Island. To cross the ocean, Link is going to need some kind of boat. A man named Rafton happens to be making a raft near the shore, but is missing the final ingredient, a rope that won't erode in the water. Another man nearby, Cheval, is working on the rope but hasn't invented it yet. In the present, after meeting the first of the animal buddies, Moosh, a flying bear that can carry Link past large gaps, under Cheval's grave, Link can find the necessary rope as well as the Zora Flippers, which let him swim in shallow water and dive to avoid enemies. There are also some underwater 2D areas he can swim through that have a couple unique enemies like Cheep Cheeps from Super Mario Bros. There's a couple items that work underwater, but not many, and we haven't gotten to any of them. Despite the rope being in Rafton's possession, after returning to the past, he also asks Link to find an island chart. Those familiar with Wind Waker might know what that means. Back in the present, the second animal friend, Ricky the kangaroo, helps Link reach Tingle. Ricky can throw punches, including launching tornadoes as a projectile, and hop up ledges, as well as over gaps, but Link already has the Rock's Feather, so that's not an excessively useful ability. After getting the chart from Tingle, Link can finally set sail. On its maiden voyage, the raft is pulled into a storm and Link washes up on Crescent Island. When he awakes, he's surrounded by a race only found in this game, lizard men named the Tokay, who have taken all his stuff. The following segment is the best of the game, so good that Fujibayashi would go ahead and use it again nearly beat for beat in Skyward Sword. Without any items, Link is incredibly limited, and each item Link reobtains lets Link travel further into the island. Some are found through minigames, like the meat throwing one, and eventually Link will need to trade his shovel to loan out his power bracelets or rock feathers to move around. Since he can only loan out one at a time at first, he'll have to go back and forth between the shop to switch them out. Ultimately, the goal of this segment is to plant the scent tree in the past. When it grows in the present, Link can get the scent seeds, which lure enemies to their location, which he can trade to reobtain his final few items. Except for his shield, which isn't returned but can be repurchased. Much later, Link can return to Crescent Island with a new item to find a hidden cave where he can reobtain his shield, which has been polished into the slightly stronger metal shield. Crescent Island is such a great segment of the game. It's so fun to have things so limited, even being cut off from the sword and having to play through a tiny Metroidvania-like maze thing to reobtain them all. It's a really creative and almost downright genius segment that really kind of just turns the whole island into its own little puzzle box thing. Once fully re-equipped, Link can finally return to present-day Crescent Island and enter Moonlit Grotto, the third dungeon. Moonlit Grotto centers around 2 major gimmicks, a wheel that sends Link left to right depending on how it was last used, which he'll need to manipulate to get where he needs to be, and the 4 crystals strewn among the top floor of the dungeon. When all 4 are broken, the wheel drops into the lower section, opening up new areas in the basement. Midway into the grotto, Link receives the Seed Shooter, a projectile that can launch any of Link's seeds in the 4 cardinal directions or diagonally in any direction. Seeds will ricochet up to 2 times, and each seed will have slightly different uses. Flame seeds light enemies on fire, as well as torches from a distance. Mystery seeds harm a few bosses in unique situations. Scent seeds just act as like the basic projectile. Weirdly enough, the mid-boss of this dungeon, Subterror, is based around usage of the shovel, which has become fairly irrelevant at this point for anything besides rupee farming. Link can dig the giant mole up to expose him to Link's sword. I'm skimming over things quite a bit, because this is going to be a long video regardless, but the dungeon is the step in the right direction the game needed. The wheel adds a lot in forcing the player to think about how they move to position it. The shooter gets a bunch of puzzle based around ricocheting seeds, not just here, but through the rest of the game. This is the first dungeon in the game that actually feels like a proper dungeon, where the first 2 feel very hand-holdy and tutorial-y. Everything around Moonlit is so good. The boss Shadow Hag will spawn enemies and travel around the room. After surviving long enough, she'll try to approach Link from behind. If Link turns to look at her, she'll vanish. Instead, the fairly clever solution to her fight is to ricochet seeds off the walls back to her as she approaches. She's a good end cap to a great segment of the game, leading to Link retrieving the Echoing Howl and a hint from the Maku Tree that the next essence is located in the hills to the west. To escape the island, Link needs the help of the final animal buddy, Dimitri, a Dodongo that Link can use to swim through water, pick up with the power bracelets to throw him across gaps. With the Seed Shooter in hand, Link can return to Tingle to upgrade his seed satchel capacity at this time. After returning to shore, Link has the opportunity to decide on his permanent animal buddy, Ricky by doing well enough in the shooting gallery, and Dimitri by buying his flute from the store, and Moosh if neither of these options are taken. It honestly only matters for the next section, after which they get very little usage. Pretty much all of their abilities kind of have their roles replaced with things that Link gets later. Left of Lina is the Noon Highlands. After crossing the bridge, the forest fairies will inform Link that they accidentally trapped an animal in the forest. Whichever one he has is a selected animal buddy. After rescuing the animal, the Noon Highlands will change slightly to play the strengths of the permanent animal buddy with a small obstacle course to navigate to get 3 guys back to work on building the bridge out to Symmetry City. In the present, Symmetry City is nothing but an active volcano in ruins with 1 tree containing gale seeds, the game's fast travel. Using a seed allows Link to warp to any other activated tree in the game. In the past, Symmetry Village as it was then known had its sacred tuning nut broken, causing the volcano to go wild. Link promises to take the tuning nut to Restoration Wall to have it fixed and save the town. Just outside of the village, Link can learn the Tune of Currents, a song that lets him travel back from the past to the present at will. While he still needs to use his portals to go back in time, his options are broken wide open by allowing him to move back and forth more quickly, although it also highlights a small issue with the Harp of Ages. The songs take too long to play, and trying to teleport in an invalid location bumps Link back to the past where he needs to relocate and play the song again. It's not game ruining or anything, but given how often he goes back and forth, I would have appreciated it being a little snappier. Now that he has more flexibility in time, Link will use tons of changing between the past and present to navigate the mountain on his path to Restoration Wall. A small side path has the bomb bag expansion for throwing a bomb into the fairy fountain. After climbing the wall, Link can give the broken nut to Patch, who will repair it if Link can defeat the Restoration game, knocking enemies into pits while periodically returning to a button in the room to prevent the minecart from hitting the nut. It's actually a fun little minigame and reappears at the end of the trading sequence to get the sword. With the nut returned, the volcano calms, and in the present, Symmetry City is now a nice town, and under its volcano is the Skull Dungeon. Skull takes a little bit of advantage of its setting by throwing in a bit of lava in many of the dungeon's rooms. Dice blocks, block pushing, and minecarts fill the first half, more complex versions of past puzzles. One new type of puzzles, and one of the few in the game designed around the theming of the dungeon, are the lava freezing puzzles. Pulling a lever back turns lava temporarily into stone, and Link must move quickly through small mazes that often have flying enemies to complicate the matter before the stone can return to lava. The mid-boss Armos Warrior has a very unique fight for the game. The warrior himself holds a shield and is immune to Link's attacks, but his magic sword, which attempts to track Link, is strong enough to destroy the knight's shield, after which it becomes vulnerable to sword attacks. Just after, Link gets the Switch Hook, one of Age's most unique tools. Link can extend the hook out to certain items, these diamond-shaped rocks, jars, or enemies, to swap his place with theirs, allowing him to reposition himself and objects to weigh down buttons, get past immovable barriers, or even just to avoid fights. It's a very cool tool to the arsenal and one with tons of potential that it lives up to throughout the game. The first fill puzzle appears, touching every tile in a room, giving some kind of reward. They don't appear often, but I think these are neat as they get larger and more complex throughout the game. After more switch hooking, Link arrives at the boss Eyesore. Soar like fly. It's such a horrible pun. Thank you, Bill Trinan. Eyesore is really underwhelming. Switch hook him to switch places with him, / go home. With the burning flame in hand, Link gets told to head to the mountain north of Nairu's house. North of Nairu's house is Rolling Ridge. When Link first arrives in the past, he finds the Goron Elder buried under a mass of rocks, preventing his advance. The only way to save him is to find a bomb flower that only grows on Rolling Ridge. Since the area is blocked off in the past, Link returns to the present to climb up the mountain. At the top, you can return to the past to find the final seed, the Pegasus Seeds, which are kind of the replacement for the Pegasus Boots in Link's Awakening. When consumed, Link gets a temporary speed boost, which also extends the length of his jump with Rock's Feather, an extra square for increased platforming potential. Using these, Link can raid the Great Moblin's Keep mini-dungeon on top of the present version of Rolling Ridge. After doing a Pegasus run through a room with a collapsing floor, Link faces the Great Moblin, a huge moblin that tosses bomb flowers at Link, who needs to toss them back just as they get ready to explode to damage him. If they're thrown too early, the Great Moblin will throw them back. After clearing this easy mini-boss, Link gets the bomb flower from the Gorons, who inform him that hundreds of years ago a boy with a bomb flower saved the Goron Elder. While minor, this game does introduce some bootstrap paradox stuff. That is, Link's past actions influence the way things play out in the present, despite them needing to happen in the present first to cause them to happen in the past. It's an interesting concept for a time travel story, but it doesn't come up much past this and one other little example. After using the bomb flower to save the Elder, he gifts Link the Crown Key, which is used to enter the Crown Dungeon in the present. The Crown Dungeon is the game's first great dungeon, centered on 2 major gimmicks. Firstly, the dungeon is very open from the start. Link can move in any direction from the get-go and begin solving things from wherever he starts. It's a bit overwhelming at first, but it's exciting to go down a branch and find something that opens a former dead end. The more tangible gimmick is the switches that raise red platforms while lowering blue ones or vice versa, which act as barriers to areas or platforms. There's many ways to activate these switches to open and close paths, and aid in exploring the open dungeon. Eventually, Link retrieves the Cane of Samaria, which simply creates a block in front of Link. While this may seem overly simple as just a way to depress switches, it actually has a lot of creative uses throughout the game. Most notably stopping blocks that are tied to each other's movement from moving when their partner blocks are pushed, and creating platforms in 2D sections. The mid-boss Smasher is another easy one. Throw his ball back at him until he dies. After more platforming, switches, and a final great Samaria puzzle, Link arrives at the boss Smog, one of the game's most creative enemies. Smog splits himself into smaller pieces, which must be combined back together. They circle blocks, and to help them reach each other, Link will need to create blocks for them to travel across with the Cane of Samaria. Each of the 4 phases gets slightly more complex than the last. It has a good mix of puzzle solving and combat together. On certain phases, 3 little Smogs appear. When 2 combine, they make a medium-sized one which moves slower and changes the strategy of making them meet. It's a really cool fight, and I wish they could all be this puzzling and involved. With the Sacred Soil in hand, Link is informed that a second essence is calling from on top Rolling Ridge. This whole next segment of the game is incredibly exhausting. After leaving the Crown Dungeon, Goron informs Link that he's built a new tunnel to a different area of Rolling Ridge. In the back half of Rolling Ridge, the Gorons have built a large town with a few complex things going on. By completing various minigames, Link can gain key items for a mini trading sequence localized in the area that goes back and forth through time. Some of the stuff in the trading quest is funny. One Goron trades a vase for some food, and in the past his ancestor asks Link for the vase as something his descendants can cherish. It's a funny little gag and the last time that bootstrapping is ever brought up in a plot-relevant way. The questionable aspect of the segment is some of the minigames. The biggest minigame is the Goron Dance, which needs to be done twice, first at the beginning and second at the end. A ridiculously precise rhythm game based around perfectly spacing out button presses blind. I'm bad at the rhythm genre as it is, but this one is just ugh. The rest are fine. Shooting gallery is touchy but manageable. After getting the required item, Link can do it a second time and get the wholly optional item, the Boomerang, which stuns enemies and grabs stuff from a distance. The Boomerang has quickly become my favorite Zelda item, despite previously thinking it was just a worse version of the bow, because it completely shuts down tons of dangerous enemies. Pretty much everything but the Dark Nuts in this game can be stunned repeatedly. Target carts is moving target practice with the Seed Shooter. Apparently this one gives people a lot of trouble, but I rather enjoyed it and didn't find it difficult at all. Once the trade sequence is mostly settled, Link plays the final game, Big Bang Game, which is just jumping about to dodge bombs for a bit to get the Old Mermaid Key, which you can show to a guy to get a letter, to talk to the past version of the dancing game, Goron, to get the regular Mermaid Key, and with both in hand, Link can start Mermaid's Cave. Mermaid's Cave uniquely takes advantage of the game's primary gimmick. There are 2 versions of the dungeon, one in the past and one in the present. Keys carry between, and changes in the past version, such as blowing up walls or opening hidden passages, will make the same changes in the present, opening paths forward. Given that changes only go from the past forward, it's best to start in the past and switch once that's exhausted and repeat as necessary. While the puzzles are good, there's nothing incredibly new, just evolutions of familiar stuff. Ricocheting seeds, switch hook stuff. Not to downplay it or call it bad, it's still very solidly designed, just more focused on its past-present thing than the new puzzle styles. The dice block puzzle of this dungeon in particular is very well done. The present version of the dungeon also has 2 wheels side by side, which adds complexity to their positioning. The mid-boss is Vyre, one of the few contextualized mini-bosses, a close minion of Varan. Vyre will swoop around the room throwing various fireballs Link can leap over with Rock's Feather before charging at him, allowing Link to get some hits in. It's a fairly challenging boss, requiring a lot of focus to bait him into attacking and timing hits. Once Vyre goes down, Link gets the mermaid suit, an upgrade to the Zora's flippers that lets him swim in deep water, including the water out in the ocean, dive deep for underwater segments, and for some reason changes the swimming controls with no warning. With the mermaid suit, Link needs to tap the direction he wants to move, which is both disorienting the first time, but also a little disorienting every time Link gets into the water. As while walking into the water, the player will be holding the D-pad to go into the water, and then he'll have to switch to the tapping method. It's a little... Regardless, with this, Link can swim past the final few barriers to reach Octagon. These fucking names, man. Octagon's fight takes place both above and below the water, although not much changes between the arenas. Above, Link needs to fire seeds at the octopus while dodging his own projectiles, and when he retreats underwater, Link needs to do the same but while swimming, as the seed shooter is one of the few items that works underwater. It's a functional use of the dungeon item, but kind of feels like a stretch. There's almost no challenge to it. Getting hit is incredibly difficult. It's just kind of like only using the seed shooter because it's the one item Link has right now that works underwater besides the switch hook. After getting the Lonely Peak, the Maku Tree informs Link that Queen Ambi has left her palace, which might give Link the opportunity to save Nairu. In front of Ambi's palace, Link bumps into Ralph, who tells him he'll need to find an alternate entrance to the palace, a cleverly hidden staircase powered by pressing 4 buttons in the courtyard. Each can be reached with a one-screen stealth segment, although since the punishment for getting caught is just getting sent back to the gates, it's easy enough to brute force them. After some more stealth inside, Link has his first encounter with Veron in Nairu's body, and it has some clever solutions. When Link got the bombs way back, Veron mentioned disliking the smell of mystery seeds, a tiny hint onto how she can be disrupted during her attacks. Once she's hit with one, her spirit leaves Nairu, and Link needs to get her away from the body to hurt her, and has the perfect tool, the switch hook. It's a really fun fight and a cool teaser to reinforce the villain. Despite saving Nairu, who pulls herself, Link, and Ralph back to the present, Queen Ambi is taken by Veron, and with the Black Tower nearing completion, her power has grown, allowing her to continue ruining the past. Nairu teaches Link the Tune of Time, which finally opens up the ability to change the age anytime, any place, which opens up pretty much everything in the game from here. The Maku tree says the next essence is coming from inside a fish, so the obvious place to check is the coast, with Link's new swimming-based powers. At this point, Link can also get the sword and shield upgrades I mentioned way earlier. By traveling to the sea in the southwest, diving, swimming, and changing ages to avoid pollution, Link can reach the underwater Zora village. The King of the Zora is sick, and Link will need a magic potion either dropped from Maple or bought from Syrup in the graveyard to cure him. Once he's cured, in the present, Link can ask him to be allowed inside of the Zora's living deity, Jabu Jabu, likely some distant descendant of Ocarina's version. Due to the pollution, he can't be allowed to access, but the king gives him a key to the nearby library, where after crossing some invisible paths, Link gets fairy powder that he can use to restore the Great Fairy of the Sea and clean the water, allowing access to the next dungeon, Jabu Jabu's belly. Immediately, a big gimmick here should be apparent: the dungeon is completely underwater. This isn't permanent though, as the central gimmick, like Ocarina's water temple, is raising and lowering the water levels. There are 3 floors and 3 water states. No water, water covering floor 1, and water covering floor 1 and 2. While swimming in water, Link is limited to problem solving using the switch hook and seed shooter, but the rising and lowering water also changes the position of certain platforms in the area. While it could potentially be annoying, the water level doesn't require frequent changing, and Link is slowly given access to each water level as he clears out the previous one. It's all very well thought out. The mid-boss is Anglerfish, a giant fish that flops about in 2D. When shot with seeds, it'll fall to the ground, allowing Link to slash at it. It's very quick, underwhelming, and simple. Immediately after, Link gets something else underwhelming, the long hook, an upgrade to the switch hook with longer reach. It's necessary for a few things in the back half of the dungeon, but it's also just a longer switch hook and feels very arbitrary. Speaking of underwhelming, again, the boss Plasmarine is another underwater boss like Octagon, but somehow even less interesting. When hit with the long hook, Link and Plasmarine switch spots, and Plasmarine swaps between red and blue each time he's hooked. When red, it shoots red orbs, when blue, it shoots blue, and needs to be struck by the orb of the opposite color it throws out. Switch back and forth a few times, and it ends. The actual dungeon south of Jabu Jabu's belly is really well designed. The fights and items, not so much. After getting the Rolling Sea, a short scene plays, showing a mysterious figure in the now complete Black Tower plotting, while the Maku tree tells Link he's on his own for finding the final essence. Immediately outside of the dungeon, Link is given his only clue. A Zora gives him a Zora skill. Finding the path forward is a bit questionable, honestly. There's one spot that Link hasn't been to yet, the area of the sea surrounded by whirlpools. But it wasn't immediately apparent, to me at least, that the solution might be circling it underwater just in case there was a Zora somewhere guarding a path to its interior in both ages, because of course it's in the past and Link starts in the present. Inside the Sea of Storms, Link finds a pirate ship full of living skeletons, apparently trapped in the vortexes for many, many years. When given the Zora's scale, they can escape the whirlpools, and as thanks, they give Link the Tokei's Eyeball, an orb they found on Crescent Island. The statue in the past version of Crescent Island is missing its eye, and giving it back opens a small cave that asks Link to test his power, wisdom, and courage. First a room full of enemies, second some block pushing, and third some invisible floors. And after a small maze full of tough enemies, Link enters the Ancient Tomb, home of the final essence. The Ancient Tomb continues downwards as Link progresses, with each floor being its own, mostly isolated little dungeon. The first basement floor has the wheel come back alongside the red and blue platform switches, which need to be platformed across to go lower, alongside containing yet another fairly underwhelming dungeon item, the Power Glove. An upgrade to the bracelet that lets Link pick up large statues, which is useful about 4 times in this dungeon and once outside to get the game's best ring, the Blue Ring, which doubles Link's defense. The mid-boss of the dungeon is Blue Stelphos, a large Stelphos that launches orbs at Links, all of which have different effects, and the largest of which can be reflected back to turn the skeleton into a little skull bat that Link can start beating down. It's honestly a better boss than most of the real bosses in this game. The second floor centers around finding 4 tablets to open the way to the final floor, each tablet being hidden behind some unique puzzle, fighting enemies on ice, dice block stuff, and the worst single screen of the game, swimming through tiny gaps in rushing water that drags Link around while the pits seemingly suck him in, if off by only a tiny, tiny hair. It's such a frustrating, I can't believe I fucking game overed in this fucking room. Ramrock is a pretty great boss as well, mostly, with 4 distinct phases. Phase 1 requires Link to smack his hands back at him. The second wants Link to get him to crush his bombs with his claws, and while I understood what it wanted immediately, I ended up second guessing myself because the placement of the bombs needs to be very precise and they don't always trigger properly, which is a little shitty. For phase 3, Ramrock guards his face with his shields and Link needs to ricochet seeds into his back while dodging his lasers. And in the final, Link needs to dodge the fists, pull them back with the power glove, and launch them back at him. It's a good final dungeon boss that makes use of a good handful of Link's tools to give it some variety. With the Falling Star in hand, the Maku Tree can reach full power and asks Link to come see her. The Maku Tree gives Link the Big Maku Seed, which has the power to lower the berry in the Black Tower and fight Veron. Before he can go, Kuma and Katake, the 2 witches known as Twin Rova, appear and tell Link that hope is lost before flying off. They're not really going to be relevant for a little bit here. From here, all that's left to do is tackle the Black Tower. After a few floors of enemies, Link gets to a few smaller puzzles in the turret of the tower. First a maze of staircases, then falling a flame to the proper staircase, and so on, before finally reaching the possessed Ambi. Ralph confronts her, planning to kill her to save everyone, despite the reveal that he's her descendant and will die as well. After Link saves him, he goes to fight Veron himself. The first phase against the possessed queen is the same as the one with possessed Nairu, although she's a bit faster and summons enemies as well. Veron's second phase is a large, evil, fairy-like creature. She'll fly around randomly and just need slashes, but also places 4 dark links in the room that move opposite the player to slightly complicate it. With Veron destroyed, Link, Ralph, and Ambi begin leaving before Veron comes back in her true form. This final phase of Veron has 3 forms itself: a giant turtle that leaps at Link, making herself vulnerable after landing a few times, a giant spider that shoots webs at Link and can be made vulnerable with bombs, and a giant bee that flies around the area spawning tiny bees and shooting projectiles, which can be attacked without prerequisites. It's a long and tough battle, given all 3 forms are done in a row, and a fitting conclusion to the game. It's a really strong final challenge to go up against, and the more prepared, the better, which is kind of like the whole idea of the game, you know? Stocking up, finding all the heart pieces, bringing a potion are definitely going to help. Following her defeat, Ralph meets his distant ancestor Ambi, and the world returns to normal with beautifully illustrated art of all the people and places Link helped. As always, there's side stuff I skimmed over, some optional upgrades, minigames, and a huge pile of rings. Doing everything but rings isn't so bad, but so many rings are tied exclusively to the gacha system that it's hard for me to want to bash my head into it. The manga adaptation looks fucking fantastic. The art is wonderful and lively. The manga confirms that Age is in fact a sequel to Seasons, as does the Hyrule Historia evidently. Ralph gets a bit more fleshing out, having more of a rivalry with Link and a much larger presence in general, and as Link is already established, there's very little downtime. Established in Seasons, that is, because the Seasons manga comes first. While following the general storyline, it's an extremely abridged version that also introduces some new elements, like Link meeting with his ancestor Raven in the past and working alongside him. The pirate captain is also expanded on greatly to explain who he is and tie him closer to the actual narrative. A lot of the narrative is skimmed through, shit goes from the start, boom, basically direct to the Black Tower. It's decent, pretty to look at, a bit brisk, but not too bad overall. It's very short, it's only 10 chapters, 11 chapters. Ages has had a weird impact on the Zelda series. I've said in both my Wind Waker and Twilight Princess videos that Zelda is a reactive series, but Ages isn't really reactive, it's more formative. It has elements pulled from the first game, Link's Awakening and A Link to the Past. The time travel is much the same as past Dark World, the seeds carry the abilities of items in former games, and the basic systems are Link's Awakenings, but it's also the birth of so much in the series. The focus Age is placed on making the journey between dungeons the real game, the real puzzle, would become a hallmark of Fujibayashi's Zelda, so much that Breath of the Wild made that almost the entire game. Minish Cap similarly built on the foundations laid by this game, and Skyward Sword began implementing minor RPG elements that the Ring system created, not to mention completely recreating the Tokei quest. It's incredible how a game so simple in most ways could have reinvented things so subtly that it led to the series as it is now. I really love Oracle of Ages. I've kind of spread it throughout, but there's a real strength to the world of Ages. There's enough information to get Link where he needs to be, but the route to that place is as fun or more fun than the dungeons. The dungeons can actually be a bit of a low point, basic, visually bland, but they often have some pretty strong puzzles to make up for it. Even if the puzzles feel a bit generic and like they could have been anywhere else, you could just take the puzzles and slot them into any other dungeon. For a Zelda story, the stakes are clear and strong, which helps drive the exploration. Every step of the adventure feels like a journey, the end goal is clear and in sight, It's just about turning the image to look at it the right way. The Ages gimmick is strong too, it adds a lot of options when it finally blooms fully, and the way the Ages affect each other works out in wonderful ways. It's a stellar journey that really captures the best parts of Zelda well, yet keeps up the pace at all times. I can't help but feel him forgetting something about the ending though. The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons is Age's twin sister. As I said before, Season tips the balance of the game towards action as opposed to puzzles. Here the game is named for Din, the Oracle of Seasons, again a power Link will eventually inherit that will be the central but not only gimmick of the exploration of the world of Holodrum. Quick note, I'm not going to run through items and mechanics I covered in the previous section. I feel it's redundant to recover bombs unless they have some new function or use. Sorry if you're just joining at this segment for whatever reason, but again, called to in a dream, Link awakens in Holodrum and meets the dancer Din, who is traveling Holodrum alongside Zelda's nurse Impa. Shortly after their meeting, the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, General Onyx, swoops in and steals Din away. His plans with her are a bit less involved than Varan's. He just wants to lock her up to cause some good old death and chaos when the seasons fall out of order. And fall they do. Throughout the game, areas will start in seasons seemingly at random, but usually specifically chosen to introduce new puzzle pieces and mechanics. Impa sends Link to nearby Horon to ask for help from Holodrum's Maku tree, but a gate prevents this. After a bit of wandering about, avoiding enemies as he's still swordless, Link will eventually reach Hero's Cave, the counterpart to Age's Maku Road. A tiny encapsulation of the game's dungeon gameplay, block pushing keys, and after he gets the wooden swords in basic combat. Back in Horon, the shop is open with the shield available, as well as various other small buildings like the ring shop, once again. After opening the gate with his sword, Link meets Season's Maku tree, this one a male, sleeping soundly until Link literally bursts his bubble. The Maku tree has been weakened by the seasonal chaos and asks Link to find the essences of nature, and gives him the gnarled key. Just north of Horon, in the region aptly titled North Horon, Link can find a small tree on an island, much like the first dungeon in the original game, the entrance to the Gnarled Root dungeon. I feel that this little journey highlights something I feel makes Season a little less interesting than Ages. Where Ages made the journey into the game, the journey in Season often feels a lot less complex or interesting. It does get better as the game's complexity increases, but it always felt like it's a much simpler and more straightforward journey between destinations. Gnarled Root Dungeon is another introductory dungeon, as straightforward as ever, and just as redundant as the one in Ages. A handful of rooms of enemies, minecarts, and block pushing eventually leads to finding the bombs to open up new paths. The dungeon's big set piece is a large room full of blades that charge Link when he moves in their paths. The mid-boss of the dungeon is the brothers Goryass, two enemies that circle the room tossing a boomerang between themselves to hit Link. They share a health pool and are defeated by simply whacking one or the other until they both vanish. Again, these early dungeons feel largely superfluous, especially when it comes to boss fights, which just are big normal enemies that are defeated with the sword. Following their defeat, Link also gets the Seed Satchel and Ember Seeds, which open the path forward by lighting some torches. Augmentus, the boss, is a remake of a boss from the first game's first dungeon, further tying this game to the plans for a full remake of Zelda 1 that it stemmed from. Augmentus is an extremely simplistic fight, either launching fireballs or charging at Link as he did in the first game, and is taken down by simply attacking his horn, the only spot where he's vulnerable. Upon defeating him, Link gains the fertile soil and is asked by the Maku tree to find the Temple of Seasons, where he can find the power necessary to move forward. Again, Maple and Gotcha Seeds are going to start coming into effect now with the same functions as the last time, and the trading sequence can be started here as well. Lighting torches for a man in Horon gives Link the first piece, which eventually leads to the sword upgrade. East of Horon, Link sees a cloaked figure discuss going to a secret place, and after following her through a tiny stealth section, he enters a portal to Subrosia, a hidden world underneath Huldrum that serves as a second, smaller map with its own puzzles and locations. While limited on options in Subrosia for now, Link can go to the Subrosian Dance Hall to participate in a much better, and by that I mean much less strict, rhythm game, which gives him the boomerang, which is just as good or better in this game. To the east is the Hall of Seasons, which Onyx sunk into the ground and dropped on top of Subrosia. Inside, Link meets the first Spirit of Seasons, Winter, who grants Link the Rod of Seasons and imbues it with the power of Winter. When Link stands atop a stump in the overworld, he can swing the rod to change the seasons in the area to winter, which is thankfully incredibly quick compared to Age's songs, and winter is the most different of the seasons, which freezes water and causes snow to pile up, either small piles that can be shoveled away, or large piles that open alternate paths. The other seasons are much less extreme in their differences. After leaving Subrosia the way he came, Link can change the season to winter to cross a pond that previously blocked his path. Deep into the woods of winter, Link finds a house whose chimney he can reach with a pile of snow dropping into it. The woman demands she clear her walkway and gives him the shovel, which serves the same purpose as in Age's. Now that he can clear the path forward, Link reaches the next tree containing mystery seeds, and directly above is the second dungeon, Snake's Remains. Snake's Remains is surprisingly good given how early it is. There's a secret room that goes unmarked on the dungeon map that can be found looking at the giant arrow made of blocks, with a solid rupee reward, as well as some fun encounters, like tossing bombs over a pit to hit enemies on the other side. Early on, Link gets the power bracelets, which actually do have a unique function in this game, giant rolling cylinders that roll back towards Link after he pushes them, forcing him to move quickly after positioning them. A mechanic that gets some good use with falling floors and spikes in later dungeons that Link needs to avoid while pushing the cylinder thing. At one point, Link even needs to take an alternate exit from the dungeon and go in through an alternate entrance. Despite weaker overworld segments, Season has some top tier dungeons. The mid-boss is Facade, a face on the floor that summons enemies and fireballs that Link needs to toss bombs onto while he's active. Fun enough, but nothing special. The boss isn't much more interesting, Dodongo, who charges around the room, and when Link throws a bomb into his mouth, he's stunned, allowing Link to toss him into the spikes in the middle of the room. He's not a slash boss, which is nice, but he's not a whole lot more interesting than Facade. With the gift of time in hand, Link is told to investigate Spool Swamp next. At this point, Link can again decide his animal buddy for the game, a choice that's somehow even less substantial here. Ricky is the default, Dimitri can be earned through the dance hall, and Moosh can be purchased. North of Horon, in a gym, Link can win back Ricky's gloves, then utilize Ricky to cross Spool Swamp, where he'll find the Scent Seed tree. Upon reaching the swamp proper, he also gets the Pegasus Seeds. In a nearby house, Link can retrieve the Floodgate key and open a path to cross the lake, which requires a little bit of Pegasus Seeds to get through. Once the floodgate is down, the lake and its connecting river become shallow enough for Link to walk on, and he can reach a stump to turn the rest to ice and traverse downstream to find a new entrance to Subrosia. Now that he's equipped with the shovel, Link can begin mining ore in Subrosia, the currency of the underground land, including the star-shaped ore that can be found on the seaside. Besides the ribbon he'll need to progress, which he can buy with the star-shaped orb, Link can get a heart piece and the bomb bag expansion at the store right away. At the seaside, Link can find the Subrosian he followed the first time, Rosa, and go on a date with her, utilizing the key she carries to return to the Temple of Seasons to add the power of summer to the rod, which dries up certain bodies of water and causes climbable vines to grow on certain ledges. After returning upstream, Link can change the season to summer to create vines and climb into the next dungeon, Poison Moth's Lair. More rolling cylinders, block pushing, and other well-designed but not new puzzles lead to a room where Link needs to take out enemies that move opposite to him in a room full of moving ground that spirals around the room. Once they're all defeated, Link gets the Rock's Feather. After getting this, Link is introduced to a new recurring puzzle element, trampolines that bounce him up to the next floor given there's a hole above him, that can be pushed around rooms. At times he'll need to bounce up to scout the room above before repositioning the trampoline and bouncing up in the proper way. The dungeon's mini-bosses are the Omwai, 3 small-shelled creatures that pop up from pools to shoot fireballs at Link that can be pulled from the pools with the bracelets to make themselves vulnerable. Finally, the opponents in this game start gaining a layer beyond //, or I guess throw a bomb. The boss of the dungeon is Mothula, a Mothman who flies around his room firing projectiles while Link does the //. Although it has the unique element that if he falls into the pits scattered around the room, he's dropped to a lower level which causes the fight to reset. The bosses in the game still haven't caught up to the dungeon design, really. After getting the Bright Sun, Link is guided east towards the mountain at the top of the map. Now that he has summer in his control, Link can start an important side quest, killing the 4 golden beasts, harder version of normal enemies that appear in specific places in certain seasons, which awards him with the game's best ring, the Red Ring, doubling his attack power, which also stacks with sword upgrades. It's incredibly fucking broken. Now equipped with Rock's Feather, Link can enter Natsu, an area that changes for the animal buddy he has. After traversing it, Link will arrive at the Sunken City, a town which is flooded due to the chaotic weather, where he finds the Gale Seeds and meets Dimitri, and after using him to scale some waterfalls, he gets the Zora Flippers. With the ability to swim, Link can go to the Moblins Keep and have a fight in the same fashion as the one from Ages, although a bit easier as he lacks his assist Moblins, one of the many reasons I think Seasons should probably be played first. Defeating him just gives Link a heart piece. A dive through an underwater tunnel lands Link at Mount Kuoko, which conveniently has a new portal to Subrosia. Upon arrival, two Subrosians steals Rock's Feather, and to get it back, he'll once again need to do a small stealth section with them, slightly more complicated but still fairly simple. After passing through a small 2D section, Link arrives at the Temple of Seasons and gains the power of Spring, which causes certain flowers to bloom, allowing them to either be cut to progress or launching Link to new heights. Back in Holodrum, Link can use his new power to climb a small ledge and reach a spring banana for Moosh, who can fly Link to the key for the next dungeon, and after a few more climbs, Link can enter the Dancing Dragon dungeon. Dancing Dragon loves carts and switching tracks. Traveling among the paths is a central mechanic, as well as a lot of swimming. The 2D section has some Mega Man shit with these disappearing blocks. God damn. I know I kinda skimmed these dungeons, but Seasons has a lot of combat and very few dungeon-wide gimmicks. A quick side note, these bouncing energy creatures can be defeated by the boomerang, which is supremely useful for avoiding damage as it is, and as the game doesn't seem to expect you to know this, it also gives a great reward of a fairy that heals 8 health every single time. The dungeon's mid-boss is Oghanima, a small reference to A Link to the Past's Oghanim, who splits into 3 clones and launches projectiles. To spot the real one, Link needs to light the torches in the center, as only the real one casts a shadow. It's a clever solution to the fight. It's actually kinda better than the actual boss of the dungeon. After clearing the mid-boss, Link gets the slingshots. While similar to the seed shooter, and using seeds as well, the slingshot fires instantaneously and only in the 4 cardinal directions, no diagonals. In the dungeon, this is primarily used to switch minecart tracks from a distance or to light torches. The boss of the dungeon is Goma, and like Wind Waker's, it steps away from its more famous incarnations. Goma defends himself with a claw that can be cut off with the sword, and once it is, his eye is vulnerable to the slingshots. After getting the Soothing Rain, Link is guided to North Horon, specifically the Eyeglass Lake, where the next essence resides. At Eyeglass Lake, a new portal to Subrosia is opened up. South of where he arrives is a small Rock's Feather course that leads to the Bomb Flower. With this, he can blow open the way to the final season spirit, Autumn, which fills some pits with leaves and lets Link pick up mushrooms. While he's here, Link can swing by the market and get the members card, which allows him to go to the secret basement of the shop above ground, where you can buy the upgraded seed satchel and the treasure map, which reveals the location of 4 gems around the map needed for progress shortly. North of Eyeglass Lake, Link can change the season to autumn to move a mushroom and enter Unicorn's Cave in record time. This segment, more than any, shows that the overworld segments this season are not its strong suit, because it's 10 minutes of going underground, getting the thing, and leaving. Not even 10 minutes, let's be honest. Unicorn's Cave has some fine stuff, mostly just basic puzzles at first, but early on he gets access to the game's most interesting item, the magnetic gloves. Holding the button they're equipped to causes them to either push or pull, alternating each time it's pushed, although you can cancel the alternation with a sword swing, which is situationally useful. The magnetic gloves have a shocking amount of versatility. They can pull and push large weights to reposition them, pull or repulse Link away from stationary magnets, or even use them against metallic or armored enemies to drag them off ledges or pull them in for attacks. The mid-boss of the dungeon is Saiger, who rolls around spastically and eventually exposes his tail to attacks. Dodging the attacks is pretty hard, but the fight is simple enough, just more ///. Tons of creative magnetic glove use later, including on rotating floating magnets that teach Link to swap polarities in midair to fly. Link arrives at the boss, Digdogger. Digdogger makes good use of the gloves again. He can only be harmed by pushing or pulling a small spiked ball in the area at him with gloves, but this spiked ball is just as capable of hitting Link. After taking enough hits from the ball, which he can sometimes be comboed into depending on where he lands, Digdogger splits into a bunch of tiny versions of himself that all need to be smashed with the spiked ball. It's a huge ass to juggle everything that's going on, avoiding all the mini doggers or the big dogger, pushing and pulling and remembering not to pull too long to avoid getting Link hit himself. It's very exciting to manage, and with a bit of luck and skill it's possible to clear it all in a single cycle. Although I will say the speed the thing goes at when it only has one mini dogger as it picks up speed each time one is smashed is a bit ridiculous, and kinda makes it very difficult to beat if gotten to that point. But Unicorn's Cave and its boss are generally pretty fucking good. Now with the Nurturing Warmth, Link needs to find a way into the ruins in the north. With the Magnet Gloves, Link can find the red and blue ores in Subrosia to upgrade his shield if desired, otherwise the goal is to find all 4 jewels, which are scattered about in small caves that can be found on the treasure map. With all 4 jewels, Link can open the gate to Tarm Ruins. After a fairly simple season puzzle, Link can enter the Lost Woods with a nearby Deku Scrub giving him directions for escaping the otherwise endlessly looping screen, while a different Deku Scrub gives him the directions for reaching the Noble Sword if he's completed the trading sequence. At the top of Tarm is the Ancient Runes, the wheel's back, as are tons of great magnetic glove puzzles. At the midway point, Link gets the magical boomerang, an upgrade to the boomerang with higher range, the ability to damage some enemies, and by holding the button after throwing it, Link can steer it in the air. It's even better in combat use, but steering it around corners to hit switches isn't particularly interesting. One segment that is pretty cool, after entering a hallway, the walls begin closing in and Link needs to quickly sprint and jump through it, a very exciting dungeon set piece, probably the most exciting one in either of the games. The mid-boss is Fire, exactly as he was in Ages, but this time serving Onyx, and in a room that has spikes along its edges, which isn't really a relevant addition. I know I just said this, but I'm skimming the dungeons a lot now. I want to reiterate, the stuff going on in the dungeons is really good, but with an increased focus on action and combat, more action, combat, and platforming-based stuff, and just being less gimmicky, it's a lot more difficult to go into detail about stuff. Manhandle, the boss, makes good use of the magic boomerang's abilities. The giant plant sprints around the room, which is covered in shifting floors that drag Link around, who has to steer the magical boomerang into its 4 heads, which also launch projectiles. Once its heads are defeated, the solution is a bit odd. I honestly had to look it up. Hitting it with the boomerang stuns it and looks like it damages it, but after hitting it over and over and it not dying, I just threw up my hands. The solution is actually to mash the boomerang into it repeatedly to expose its heart, which isn't very well telegraphed. Despite the little hiccup, it's an interesting fight in a solid dungeon. After collecting the Blowing Wind, Link's next directive is to find a way to cross some water. For those exploring, they may have stumbled into the skeletal pirate located just outside of Horon, near the locked entrance to the desert, as well as the rest of crew, yes, the same ones who we met in Labrana, who've gotten their boat stuck and are searching for their missing bell while stuck in Subrosia. Impressed that he's explored runes, Cap'n allows Link to hunt for the bell for him, and with a password he can mimic from another crewmate, Link can enter the desert, wherein the ghost of a skeleton will ask Link to find his skull, which guides him to the bell. And after getting it polished, the pirates can return to sea, although their seasickness kicks in and they dock near Horon, opening a path to the area west of Horon. With this in place, the last golden beast is accessible and Link can get the red ring to double his attack, which is absurdly broken. To the west in the graveyard is the next dungeon, the Explorer's Crypt. The Explorer's Crypt's main gimmick is a curse placed on certain rooms. If Link can't move through them before the candles fizzle out, he'll be warped to the front of the dungeon. To avoid this, Link will need to find and fight the ghost causing it, one sister which charges him with a sword, and one that leaves a trail of fire. The eventual mid-boss of the dungeon is both Post Sisters at once, which Link must fight while constantly relighting torches to prevent getting booted. They're a fun element that entirely disappears in the middle, but their boss fight is great, and their mini boss fights are also pretty decent. More complex magnetic glove stuff keeps appearing. The devs evidently loved the item as much as I do. Eventually Link gets Rock's Cape, an upgrade to the feather which allows him to extend his jump, which also benefits from the Pegasus boost to effectively turn Link into Moosh. Given this new ability, the rest of the dungeon is very platforming centric, with big gaps and tight timing on collapsing floors. The boss Gleeok is really tough, mainly because he just does a bunch of damage. All of his heads spit different fire attacks at Link, which he can use Rock's Cape to avoid. After slashing one head enough, it'll fall off and bounce around the room. If Link can't take the other half quickly enough, it'll reattach, meaning he needs to balance attacking both heads. Once headless, the boss will begin charging at Link, who needs to jump when he smashes into walls to avoid getting stunned before continuing to slash. The head gimmick is fun, the body part might be a little excessive. The next essence is the Seed of Life, and it's a stick with 2 big dangling berries. Look at it. It's called the Seed of Life. This had to have been intentional, wasn't it? There's no way someone didn't notice. It's a dick and balls called the Seed of Life. On his own with no hint, Link needs to find the final essence, although with only one area of the map basically untouched, or the added complexity of the past-present mechanic to fusicate it, it's pretty straightforward where he's supposed to go. In the far north, Link can reach the temple remains using the Rock's Cape. The temple's remains has a pretty interesting setup, where each season gets a bit of time to shine while moving through the ruins, including a brief stop in Subrosia, where Link causes a volcanic eruption with his new Pyro-Subrosian friend to change the landscape of the ruins, which then opens the path to the top of the ruins and a final portal to Subrosia, leading to the only Subrosian dungeon. The Sword and Shield maze consists of 2 floors, one shaped as a sword, one as a shield. It's cute. There's a ton of ice everywhere on the upper floor, not necessarily a bad thing. The ice block puzzle is cool, it reminds me a lot of my days in Pokemon Gen 2. On the lower floor, there's lots of lava and tons of platforming. Eventually, Link gets the Hyper Slingshot, which splits seeds into 3s, launching 1 forward and 2 diagonally. Underwhelming, honestly. It's used to activate some simultaneous switches, but it doesn't have that much functionality different from the regular slingshot. The mid-boss is Fry Polar, a burning ghost that swaps between his fire and ice forms, fire-shooting projectiles while ice spawns crystals. The solution is a bit obscure, but does utilize the Hyper Slingshot. In order to damage Fry Polar, Link needs to shoot mystery seeds at the ice crystals to shrink them, then pick them up and throw them at Fry Polar's fire form. Link has a bit of agency, being able to change Fry Polar's form with mystery seeds, but figuring out the actual solution is a bit poorly telegraphed. I don't know why one's first thought would be to shoot the ice that's just hanging around on the floor with mystery seeds, to be honest. Following this, the dungeon takes on a new and fairly unique gimmick where Link needs to safely carry magical ice crystals to throw down to the lava on the floor below, causing it to freeze over and open a path to the boss. The boss Metallock has the same issue as the mid-boss. The thing is dangerous and fast and immune to damage until it's shot with Pegasus Seeds, which have never been used in this way in either game. I have no idea why it's Pegasus Seeds, if it has something to do with the boss kind of looking like Medusa. The boss is tough even knowing its weakness, and it's pretty fun, but the weakness is just like, I have no idea how someone's supposed to figure that out outside of just running out of other seeds to shoot it with. Link gets the final essence, the changing seasons, and with that, all that's left is to stop Onyx once and for all. After getting the Maku seed from the Maku tree, Link can enter Onyx's castle in the north. As before, Twinrova appears and tells Link how useless his efforts are, that it's too late. After clearing a few rooms of enemies, including the mid-boss Facade, the floor face guy from the second dungeon again for some reason, Link reaches Onyx. The castle probably should have had a bit more going on like the Black Tower. Like, the Black Tower wasn't a great dungeon, but it was better than that. Onyx stomps about, tossing his ball and chain at Link occasionally, who needs to dodge these attacks and retaliate with spin attacks, the only attack that can damage him. After taking enough damage, he'll begin shielding himself with Din, who Link can bat away with the Rod of Seasons, which is also kind of a weird solution, but it does slash like a sword without cutting her, so... Once Onyx is defeated and Din is freed, the floor collapses from beneath Link, dropping into the true final fight, Onyx the Dark Dragon. Dark Dragon Onyx has a wide variety of attacks, swiping across the screen, punching at Link, and spamming projectiles. He hits incredibly hard, and hits quite a bit if he wants to. Those fireballs can just hit over and over. Link does not get very many invincibility frames off getting attacks. It's a minor issue throughout both games, but enemies can just keep bumping into him and deal a lot of fucking damage very quickly. The solution to this phase is simple enough. Jump on his hands when they're on the ground, jump up and hit his crystal, which is in his forehead. With good timing, it's possible to jump between his hands a few times to get more than one hit in. While his first phase is pretty underwhelming, the second is very good, especially considering the action focus of Seasons, but it's definitely worth considering bringing a potion because it's also pretty difficult, even fully maxed out. It's a good boss. It makes good use of the items that Link has with the cape, and it's a very strong, action-y ending where Veron was a bit more puzzly, still very heavy in the action, but... With that, Din is saved, and there's even more wonderful art showing the world recovering. Again, there's some side stuff, basically the same stuff, not going to go too much into it, but it's a lot of the same, some minigame stuff, heart pieces, rings, and so on. Guess I best get into the manga real quick. The art is fantastic as before, very clean and capturing the official art very, very well. It also contextualizes the opening bit of both games a little bit, explaining that him finding the Triforce in the castle is what brought him to Haldrum a little more clearly. As I stated in the section on the previous manga, the manga confirms that Seasons is in fact the beginning, followed by Ages, which is also backed up by Hyrule Historia. Onyx is made much more intimidating, he appears much more and more substantially, he actually interacts with Link and he kills grass wherever he walks, which is cool. It's a lot more than the game bothers to give him. He probably should have had some kind of interaction in the middle of the game like Veron got. Link spends a lot more time with Din, and there's a bit of romance there too. Link also gets a talking baby chick companion named Pyoko, who's cute, but also, like, why? Generally it hits the story beats of Seasons, but at a bit of a weird pace. Link meets the Maku tree halfway through the story, like 5 chapters in. And there's almost an entire chapter out of 10 which centers on getting Ricky's gloves in the boxing match and how Ricky is horny for Link evidently. As is the chicken Pyoko, of course, who wants to be reborn as a human for him. There's almost an entire chapter on Maple of all characters, who becomes a major character that travels with Link through most of the game and ends up kind of saving the day at the end. Dungeons are skipped entirely and certain bosses just kind of pop in and out at random. Just like, you know, Manhandle shows up as Link's first opponent, and the only other boss that shows up in a major way comes immediately after, and it's the Medusa head. It's a good manga, it's a little too quick, things happen very suddenly, but the art is fantastic, and it's a nice little companion piece for the games. Seasons, unlike Ages, feels like it had a much lesser impact on the development of Zelda. It's much harder to point to things and say this, and this carried forward in the later games. It's a bit more nostalgic for the past, pulling bosses and ideas from the first game, but just has a lesser impact than its sister game. Like, Oracle of Seasons is still good, it just feels like a lesser game a little bit. It has strong dungeons that are well made, but they have less strong gimmicks. They may be base level better than Ages, but they're less interesting as a whole. Ages builds a strong identity around the journey, the exploration of the worlds, like all the space between the dungeons, while Seasons doesn't seem to care as much for that element, more so just for good dungeons. It's well made, it has some great items, and it's definitely good, it's just not nearly as interesting as Ages. Oh, right, I forgot something. Wait, I already played Ages. I think I did something wrong. Right, linked game. After beating one of the games, the player is given a code that lets them carry their progress over, kind of. There's a few things that are in both. Link starts off with an additional heart as well as sword. In Ages, this means Impa gives him a free shield instead of the sword, while in Seasons, this means Link can skip the hero's cave for now. There's a few bits of interconnectivity too. Link can pass his rings from the first game to the second, and secrets appear in the second game. Upon finding new NPCs in the world, they'll give Link a secret he can pass to the first game, where he'll either be given a reward or do a minigame for a reward, including the Master Sword, which is twice as strong as the Noble Sword, the Mirror Shield, which reflects projectile, an additional heart container, further seed, bomb, and ring capacity upgrades, additional rings, and 2 unique items, bomb shoes, which are curling bombs that move in a straight line before exploding, and the Big Ron Sword, which swings in a massive 180-degree arc in front of Link, but can't spin attack or shoot lasers. Link's animal companion from the first game also carries into the second. Both games also reference the fact that it's the second adventure in small ways. Characters from the first game will appear visiting the second. Recurring characters like Impa, the Skeleton Pirates, and Moblin King will recognize Link, and Zelda will make small appearances in the game. In Ages, she appears early on and gets kidnapped by Fire, giving Link a unique platforming bit that pays homage to Donkey Kong to save her. Then she reappears near the end attempting to help people, where Seasons has an early point that she's taken by the Moblin King and Link needs to fight off some enemies for her. Later she'll appear in much the same way. Some storylines also see some closure. Throughout Ages, it's mentioned that Ambi built the tower to find her long-lost lover, and in the Linked Seasons game we find his identity, the skeletal pirate Cap'n, and they even have a brief reunion that's very adorable. In the main game, things play out mostly the same, but there are a few additions. In both games, Hero's Cave is expanded into a challenge dungeon that has a frankly redundant ring as a reward, given how easy the red and blue rings are to get. In Ages, the cave appears near Mako Road, while in Seasons, Hero's Cave replaces the original. Each one is unique and requires using every dungeon item in the game to get through. Ages plays a lot with block pushing, ricocheting seeds, tricky switch hook item repositioning. There's a tile flipping puzzle that's impossible to complete, unless Link uses the Cane of Samaria to fill the last block, which is just fucking cruel and made me restart this thing over and over thinking I was fucking up. Plus the most evil dice block puzzle ever made, where Link needs to quickly move it after pulling a lava switch before the tiles disappear and drop him into the lava, which of course respawns him on top of the portal he took in, which restarts the puzzle. And it doesn't get much better with the final incredibly precise Rock's Feather jumps. Ages Hero Cave is okay. The puzzles feel intentionally unfair, not only in solution but execution. As a bonus challenge, I guess it's fine, but it just feels like way too much for its very unsubstantial reward. Meanwhile, the Seasons version isn't nearly as harsh. As before, tons of block or pot pushing, lots of platforming with Rock's Cape, which is much less difficult than the other one, more focus on combat, a really cool and challenging magnetic glove section, the infuriating RNG of whatever the fuck this thing is supposed to be, this horrible section with the magic boomerang, And a really cool final riddle where Link is put in a room that serves as a tiny recreation of Hologram, and he needs to pick the chests in the order of the dungeons he completed. Very cool way to reward knowledge of the game. Hero's Cave, the linked version in Seasons, is fine. It's more reasonable than its Ages counterpart, well made and fun enough. I'd say it's better than Ages, but the mediocre reward for both are just a big bummer. Of course, there's also a new ending to the games. Immediately after clearing Veron or Onyx in their respective games, both oracles will appear and transport Link to the true final dungeon, the Room of Rites, which is identical in both games. With both flames lit, Twinrova captures Zelda, planning to sacrifice her to revive Ganon. After the only non-boss section, a short maze where Link just keeps moving in the direction the eyes aren't looking, appears. Everything after this is just bosses, first Kume and Kotake. The pair fly around the room throwing orbs matching their color at Link, which will need to be slashed towards the other. Well, it's not hard, in fact it's very difficult to take any substantial damage in this part of the fight. Actually aiming the orbs is rough. Thankfully the pair share a health pool, but it still might be a bit. Once their shared health is depleted, the witches fuse into Twinrova, another boss who can be a bit confusing. Twinrova alternates between her ice and fire forms. In the ice form, the floor is slippery and she summons pucks that bounce around to harm Link, while in lava, lava pools appear in the arena while she launches projectiles and summons enemies. The ice phase is ridiculously easy, basically requiring holding forward and slashing, while the knockback Link receives from hitting her makes the fire form risky given the lava all around. It's best to pass on the lava phase and fish for hearts from the enemies if in danger. After slashing a few times, Twinrova is made vulnerable to Mystery Seed shots, although this is again very badly indicated, if my 15 or so minutes of wondering why she had so much health or anything to go off of. Once Twinrova goes down, she switches to Plan B, sacrificing herself instead of Zelda for the resurrection, but due to this, Ganon comes back as a simple raging beast. Ganon will warp around the room, either dashing at Link for a stab or launching fireballs. With the wooden sword, he can only be hurt with spin attacks, but with the others, regular slashes work just fine, although given he often teleports off screen for a bit, it's still best to rely on spin attacks for the 2x damage boost. He's not all that interesting, nor does he have a second form like the earlier final bosses did, he just deals a metric fuck ton of damage. It's not a horrible fight, I guess, but it's more slashy and less something interesting going on. It's a little limp given the build-up and a little limp considering the earlier final bosses were better. And that's finally it. 2 entire games. Whew. The world returns to normal with even more great art. In Ages, Link gets a kiss from Zelda, and the Maku tree feels sad. And Link sails off to new adventures. The Room of Rites is okay, it's basically some extra bosses. I guess they felt it'd be shitty to lock excessive amounts of content behind the Link game, but I would have liked an actual dungeon for the final, bonus thing. I've mostly already covered my thoughts on each game alone. Honestly, the Link game doesn't add much, and 2 playthroughs of each was probably excessive. The bonus content isn't mind-blowing and probably only needs the 1 play for each. That said, I find both games enjoyable, especially as a pair. Obviously, I'm biased a little bit towards Ages. I think it's a much better game with its explory world and the journey and all that. Seasons has really good dungeons. It's still incredibly solid. It's just slightly below for me. I would strongly recommend playing both though, starting with Seasons and then going into Ages. The main reason, besides the fact that this is apparently the canon order, not only is Ages the stronger game, but it makes more sense narratively to have things happen that way, the pirates get out of the sand and then sail into the whirlpools instead of going in the whirlpools, getting stuck in the sand and then sailing out. The finale of Ages is a lot bigger too, with the Black Tower instead of just going into Onyx's room. There's more of a story focus. It just feels like the one that serves as a better ending. Both still very good, play both. This took a long time to record. What is my recording time at? Very nearly 2 hours. My throat is fucking killing me. I really hope you enjoyed this. The next one will be Mega Man 0, 1, 0, 1, the first 0. And yeah, subscribe. My throat hurts. Yes. Thank you for watching. Bye.